The soft rain pattered gently against the tall windows of the Whitmore townhouse, nestled in one of London's most exclusive neighborhoods. The elegant Georgian home stood as a symbol of wealth and prestige, a reflection of the Whitmore legacy that spanned generations. Inside, the grandeur of high ceilings, polished marble floors, and carefully curated art gave the impression of perfection, but not everything inside the Whitmore home was as polished as it appeared. Eleanor Whitmore sat at the edge of the plush velvet settee, her hand resting gently on her rounded belly. She was glowing, not just with the natural radiance of pregnancy but also with anticipation. Today was the day, the appointment that would reveal whether she was carrying a son or a daughter. It was a milestone she had imagined sharing with Edward, her husband, ever since they'd first discovered the pregnancy. Eleanor had met Edward 6 years ago at a charity event. Tall, commanding, and devastatingly intelligent, he was a force in the British business world, a billionaire by 32 and a Whitmore by blood. Their courtship had been fast, glamorous, and carefully observed by tabloids, but what the world never saw was the quiet tenderness Edward had once shown her. He would bring her Earl Grey tea during her late study nights at Oxford, slip handwritten notes into her books, and once flew back from New York just to see her for a few hours. That version of Edward had vanished somewhere in the last year, swallowed by boardrooms, business mergers, and endless commitments. His absences had become a silent third presence in their marriage. She glanced at her phone again, 10:42 a.m. The appointment was at 11. Her fingers hovered over Edward's contact before she finally opened their last conversation. Her eyes scanned the message she had received less than 5 minutes ago. Something came up. Can't make it. Sorry. No punctuation, no explanation. Just like that, the moment she had waited for, planned for, unraveled. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she inhaled deeply, the way the breathing coach had taught her. Her eyes closed briefly, steadying her heart. For the sake of the tiny life growing inside her, she had to be calm. But inside, something shifted. It wasn't rage, not quite heartbreak. It was the slow dawning of understanding. She was alone in this moment, and not because Edward had no time, but because he chose not to make it. Eleanor sat in the back seat of the sleek black town car, her hands folded over her belly, still warm from the memory of the disappointment that had threatened to ruin her morning. She refused to let Edward's absence steal this moment from her. If he wouldn't come, then she would go without him. Not alone, not entirely. To her left sat Margaret Whitmore, her mother-in-law, impeccably dressed as always in a tailored cream coat and matching gloves, her posture as straight as the spine of a book. Margaret had always been the kind of woman who moved through life as though everything around her were part of an orchestrated symphony she conducted from a distance. Reserved, regal, and often cold. Eleanor had never felt truly embraced by her. Their relationship had been cordial at best, filled with polite smiles and stiff small talk over brunches and family functions. But today, Margaret had surprised her. When Eleanor had quietly mentioned Edward's cancellation over breakfast, said with the casual bravery of someone trying not to cry into her tea, Margaret had simply said, "You shouldn't go alone. I'll come with you." And now here they were, riding through the grey morning streets of London. Across from them sat Daniel Reeves, the Whitmore family lawyer, dressed in a sharp navy suit and tapping quietly on his tablet. He had been part of Edward's world long before Eleanor entered the picture, the kind of solicitor who handled everything from estate management to crisis control. He rarely spoke unless asked, and when he did, it was with clipped precision. Eleanor had never thought much of him, except that he seemed deeply loyal to the family and utterly uninterested in gossip or drama. She didn't expect his presence today, but when Margaret insisted, Daniel had arrived within minutes, briefcase in hand. Eleanor had initially resisted. Why would a lawyer need to attend a baby scan? Margaret had answered simply, "You need someone on your side." The comment had lingered in Eleanor's mind like the echo of something deeper. Still, she couldn't focus on riddles or tension now. She was heading to see her child, the life she carried beneath her heart, the tiny miracle that kept her grounded when the world around her tilted. Margaret's gloved hand gently touched hers during a quiet moment at a red light. Eleanor turned slightly, surprised by the tenderness in her touch. "You know," Margaret said softly, "you once sat with me for 7 hours in that hospital suite. When they found the tumor. You didn't even know me that well then. But you stayed." Eleanor remembered. It had been early in her engagement to Edward, long before she knew what the Whitmore family demanded of those who married in. Margaret had been frightened and vulnerable, and Eleanor had stayed because she couldn't bear the thought of anyone going through that alone. That day had built something between them, not quite friendship, but a quiet understanding. Now, in this car, with Daniel tapping away and Margaret holding her hand, Eleanor realized the dynamic was shifting. She still felt the sting of Edward's betrayal, not just today, but in all the little ways he had been slipping away. But she also felt something else, the fragile beginnings of an unexpected alliance. And for now, she would focus on the appointment ahead, on the heartbeat waiting to be heard, and the future beginning to unfold. The room was softly lit, quiet except for the occasional click of the ultrasound technician's keyboard. Eleanor lay back on the examination table, her blouse lifted just above the swell of her belly, a thin layer of cool gel spread across her skin. The monitor flickered to life beside her, and the technician, a kind-eyed woman named Amanda, moved the probe gently, coaxing the image of the baby into view. Beside her, Margaret sat in a visitor's chair, posture rigid but her eyes locked on the screen. Daniel stood just behind them, silent as always, arms folded but noticeably more alert than usual. The tension from earlier had melted into anticipation, the kind that hummed low and steady in the chest. Then it came, that rapid, unmistakable sound. A heartbeat. Fast and strong, like the flutter of tiny wings echoing through the speakers. Eleanor's breath hitched, her eyes fixed on the monitor where a small form shifted gently in the black and white haze. Her heart swelled with awe and disbelief every time she heard that sound. No matter how many times they told her it was normal, that everything was progressing beautifully, it never failed to strike her with wonder. That sound was life. That was her baby. "Would you like to know the gender?" Amanda asked gently, pausing with practiced care. Eleanor nodded, almost breathless. The technician smiled and turned slightly toward the screen. "Congratulations," she said softly. "It's a girl." "A girl." Eleanor's lips parted in a stunned whisper, but no words came out. Her hand instinctively reached toward the screen, her other moving to cover her mouth as tears brimmed and spilled freely down her cheeks. A girl. She could already see her, not just the outline on the monitor, but the little curls that might frame her face, the stubborn chin she'd inherit from Edward, the gentle eyes Eleanor would pass down. She had dreamed of this moment, imagined it a dozen times, but the reality of it was something else entirely. Beside her, Margaret let out a small, audible breath. When Eleanor turned, she saw a different woman than she was used to, softer, her eyes glassy. Margaret reached out and took Eleanor's hand with uncharacteristic warmth. "I never had a daughter," she said quietly. "Only Edward. And his father, well, he wasn't the most gentle man. But a girl, she'll change you, Eleanor. In the best way." Eleanor couldn't hold it in anymore. The weight of everything, the beauty of the moment, the absence of her husband, the ache that had followed her since that morning, it broke through. She cried, not loudly, but deeply, and Margaret stood to hold her in an embrace that felt maternal and real. Eleanor sobbed into her shoulder, whispering through tears, "He should have been here. He missed this." Margaret gently stroked her back, voice low but firm. "Maybe you shouldn't go through this alone anymore. Not if he's choosing to be absent." In the corner, Daniel looked away discreetly, giving them space, but there was something in his posture, his jaw slightly clenched, his hands fidgeting, that betrayed how moved he was. Though he said nothing, his presence, steady and respectful, was its own kind of support. And as Eleanor wiped her tears and looked again at the tiny figure on the screen, she realized that while one door had quietly shut behind her, another had opened, and this time, she wasn't walking through it alone. Later that afternoon, as the car wound its way out of the city and into the leafier outskirts of Surrey, Eleanor sat between Margaret and Daniel, her hands resting quietly on her lap, still processing the emotional whirlwind of the morning. The ultrasound appointment had left a hollow ache inside her, not because of what she had discovered, but because of who hadn't been there to witness it. She hadn't expected laughter or tears from Edward, but a simple presence, his hand in hers, his voice beside her, would have been enough. Instead, she sat in silence, feeling the slow unraveling of the life they had built. The car turned off the main road and rolled through the wrought iron gates of a secluded estate, one Eleanor didn't recognize. The house that came into view was not grand in the usual Whitmore way. It was more understated, with ivy crawling along the stone walls and a quiet dignity to its architecture. As the vehicle came to a stop, Daniel opened the door and offered his hand. Margaret followed closely, her heels clicking softly across the cobblestone drive. Inside, the mood shifted. They led Eleanor to a quiet study where the curtains were partially drawn, casting soft shadows across the wood-paneled room. A leather folder sat on the desk, already opened. Daniel gestured for Eleanor to sit, his tone uncharacteristically gentle. "There's something we need to show you," he said, his voice low and serious. "And I need you to understand, this isn't easy to share. But it's necessary." Eleanor blinked, unsettled. "What do you mean?" Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's about Edward. Things you haven't been told." Eleanor looked between them, a chill creeping up her spine. "Why are you showing me this?" I thought your loyalty was to him." Margaret's expression didn't waver. "It was. Until he stopped deserving it." Daniel opened the folder and began to explain, laying out a series of documents with clinical precision. There were bank records first, large transfers, routed through shell companies based in the Isle of Man and Dubai. Some tied back to business ventures she had never heard of, others to private accounts. Then came property records, a penthouse in Mayfair leased under an alias, with a driver's log showing Edward's frequent visits over the last 6 months. Photographs. Receipts. A pattern of secrecy too deliberate to ignore. Eleanor stared, her vision blurring as the pieces formed a picture she never wanted to see. She had suspected things were wrong between them, but not this. Not the double life. Not the betrayal rooted so deeply it had its own paper trail. "How long?" she whispered, voice tight. Daniel didn't look away. "At least 8 months. Possibly longer." Margaret knelt beside her, her voice barely above a whisper. "You needed to know. Before he tries to make you feel like you're the one who's done something wrong." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, a blend of sorrow and fury rising like a tide. She had trusted Edward with everything, her life, her dreams, her future. And now, with the evidence laid bare before her, all she could feel was the sharp, brutal sting of the truth. He had already started building a life without her in it. The next afternoon, under a sky of shifting gray clouds, Eleanor found herself parked discreetly across from an upscale residential building in Mayfair, nestled among rows of polished townhouses and luxury boutiques. The penthouse windows were tinted, the kind of privacy that money buys without question, but the security at the building was familiar to Daniel, who had arranged for them to observe from a nearby private office suite with a direct view. It felt surreal to be there, hiding in plain sight, as if she were playing a part in someone else's unraveling marriage. But it was her life, her husband, and her betrayal, no longer a suspicion, but something she had to see with her own eyes. The surveillance felt wrong at first. Eleanor wasn't someone who chased drama or lived for confrontation. She had built her life on trust, loyalty, and patience. But now, watching the large window across the street where the curtains occasionally shifted open, she knew she couldn't afford to remain naive. Margaret sat beside her, arms crossed tightly, lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel stood behind them, watching without expression but alert, phone in hand as if ready to intervene. It wasn't long before the curtain shifted, revealing Edward in a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled, holding 2 glasses of wine. He wasn't alone. A younger woman entered the frame, laughing as she took one of the glasses from him, her hand brushing his. She was beautiful in a polished, curated way, long honey blonde hair, an off-the-shoulder designer dress, perfect angles from every direction. It didn't take long for Eleanor to place her face. Talia Langford. The same Talia whose face graced the covers of society magazines, who posted designer hauls and vacation reels to millions of followers, who once bragged in an interview that I only date men who can fly me to Venice for lunch. Edward sat with her on the sofa, relaxed, smiling in a way Eleanor hadn't seen in months. He leaned in as she showed him something on her phone, their faces far too close for anything platonic. When Talia laughed, she leaned against him, her hand resting on his chest like she belonged there. Eleanor's breath hitched, her stomach tightening with a pain that went beyond anger. She didn't even realize she was crying until she felt Margaret's hand take hers. That evening, Eleanor sat in her bedroom, still unable to move. The silence was suffocating. Her phone buzzed. A notification from social media. Talia had posted a story, a carefully filtered shot of wine glasses, a candlelit spread, and a man's hand reaching across the table. Edward's hand. His wedding band unmistakable. Eleanor dropped the phone onto the bed as if it had burned her. The air in the room was too thick, the betrayal now immortalized on a public platform for all the world to see. Margaret stormed in moments later, phone in hand, voice trembling with restrained fury. "This is not how a Whitmore treats family," she snapped. "He has disgraced you. He has disgraced us all." But Eleanor said nothing. She simply stared at the image frozen on her screen, realizing that the Edward she once loved was already gone, replaced by someone who no longer saw her, no longer valued her, and no longer belonged in the life she had fought so hard to build. The days that followed were filled with quiet but calculated movements, like pieces shifting on a private chessboard. Eleanor refused to crumble under the weight of betrayal. If Edward thought she would simply disappear into the background while he paraded around with Talia Langford, he had sorely underestimated her resolve. The Whitmore name might have belonged to him by birth, but Eleanor had earned her place in the family, through dignity, loyalty, and years of standing at Edward's side in silence. That silence was over. With Daniel's help, they began preparing legal groundwork, methodically and without drawing attention. Everything was to remain confidential, at least for now. Eleanor didn't want a public scandal, not yet, but she wanted protection. She wanted to ensure her child's future and her own dignity were not swept aside by Edward's recklessness. Daniel began with reviewing the prenuptial agreement. As expected, it had been heavily weighted in Edward's favor, filled with typical protections for a man of his wealth and standing. But there were loopholes, especially around infidelity and reputational harm. They worked long hours in Daniel's private office, poring over financial records, assets, and trust structures, documenting everything they would need if this went to court. During one late-night session, as Eleanor rubbed her aching back and stared at spreadsheets detailing offshore accounts and luxury real estate, Daniel broke the silence. "You know, Eleanor, you're not the first woman in this family he's tried to erase. But you might be the first who won't let him." His tone was quiet but filled with admiration, and something else, not romantic, but a steady respect that hadn't been there before. It was a subtle shift between them, one born from shared battle rather than intimacy. Margaret, too, became more involved than Eleanor ever expected. One morning, over tea in the garden, she dropped a revelation like a stone in still water. "He doesn't know," she said, staring out at the roses. "But I still hold controlling shares in the family's core holdings. I never signed them over fully. He's been assuming authority, but legally, I can revoke it any time." Eleanor blinked, stunned. "Why haven't you?" Margaret's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "Because I was waiting to see if he deserved it. Now I know he doesn't." With that knowledge, their strategy evolved. It wasn't just about proving Edward's betrayal, it was about preparing Eleanor to stand on equal footing, or higher. They began mapping out press angles, how to leak certain documents if needed, how to quietly contact shareholders should it become necessary to call for a vote of no confidence. They reviewed custody laws, prepared statements, drafted contingencies for every possible scenario. Through it all, Daniel remained by Eleanor's side, calm, capable, and fiercely protective. Though no romantic lines were crossed, there were moments of silence between them that spoke volumes. Shared glances, quiet nods of understanding, and the kind of trust that grows not from affection, but from survival. Eleanor didn't need saving. But in Daniel and Margaret, she had found something far rarer, allies who were just as tired of Edward's lies as she was, and just as determined to make him answer for them. The ballroom of the Royal Lancaster Hotel sparkled with opulence as guests filtered into the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, an event that drew the most influential figures in business, politics, and high society. The chandeliers shimmered overhead, the champagne flowed endlessly, and the buzz of polite conversation carried a familiar elegance. The Whitmore family always made an entrance, always commanded attention, but this year, it wasn't Edward who stole the spotlight. It was Eleanor. She arrived in a floor-length silk gown of deep emerald green, the fabric flowing over her pregnant form like water, her skin luminous beneath the soft lights. Her hair was swept into an elegant chignon, diamond earrings glinting as she moved with quiet confidence across the room. Gasps and whispers trailed behind her. Everyone had expected her to be absent, given Edward's increasingly public outings with Talia Langford. Rumors had swirled, but no confirmation had surfaced. And now, here she was, alone, glowing, and utterly poised, as if betrayal had only sharpened her brilliance. Margaret followed closely, equally commanding in a midnight blue gown, a picture of cold Whitmore strength. Daniel, ever composed, lingered near the edges, mingling with board members and trustees, briefcase discreetly in hand. They were no longer just family. They were a unit, a formation with purpose. It wasn't long before Edward entered, oblivious to what awaited him. He strolled in confidently with Talia on his arm, the younger woman beaming in a sheer silver dress designed to turn heads, and it did. But not in the way she intended. The moment they were spotted, a visible ripple moved through the crowd. Guests exchanged looks, glances flicking between Edward's date and his heavily pregnant wife across the room. Edward spotted Eleanor almost instantly. He faltered for just a second before composing himself, adjusting his cufflink with the performative ease of a man too arrogant to imagine his empire cracking. But there was something in Eleanor's eyes that made him pause, not grief, not heartbreak. Power. It unsettled him. Dinner passed with an uneasy civility. Eleanor greeted guests with warmth, Margaret delivered her usual thank yous to donors, and Edward tried to dominate the room with carefully rehearsed charm. But then the lights dimmed, and Eleanor stepped onto the stage. She stood behind the podium, her hands gently resting on the edge, her voice clear and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone even, "I stand before you tonight not just as the wife of Edward Whitmore or as the chairwoman of this foundation's maternity initiative, but as a woman who believes deeply in legacy, truth, and the responsibility we carry to those who come after us." The room fell into an attentive hush. "We build empires, reputations, and fortunes," she continued, "but what value do they hold if we abandon the principles that built them? Tonight, I speak not just for myself, but for the next generation, for our daughters, our sons, and the world they will inherit. And I say this, power is not inherited. It is earned. And it must be protected from those who abuse it." Her words were calculated, every syllable striking the heart of the matter without ever naming Edward directly. But the message was unmistakable. As she stepped down from the stage to a smattering of stunned applause, Daniel quietly moved through the room, discreetly handing sealed envelopes to selected board members, a curated set of financial disclosures, photographs, and legal summaries. Margaret, meanwhile, whispered pointedly to a pair of longtime family investors, nodding toward Edward with a look of grim finality. It didn't take long for Edward to feel it. The energy around him shifted, the looks, the polite but distant nods, the murmured conversations just out of earshot. His confidence faltered as realization crept in. Something was wrong. Something had been set in motion, and he hadn't seen it coming. And as Eleanor took her seat beside Margaret, Daniel now standing protectively nearby, Edward watched her from across the ballroom, not as a wife scorned, but as a woman who had just delivered the opening move in a war he never imagined she'd have the courage, or the power, to start. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. By morning, headlines splashed across financial news sites and society columns alike. Whitmore's scandal unfolds at gala and affair, fraud, and fallout, Edward Whitmore under fire. Eleanor's speech had been vague enough to keep her dignity intact, but the documents quietly distributed during the event spoke volumes. Someone, likely a board member with a personal score to settle, had leaked them to the press before dawn. By lunchtime, it was the only topic anyone in London's corporate circles could talk about. Edward's reputation, once ironclad, was now riddled with questions and whispered speculation. The Whitmore family board, already rattled by declining public trust in Edward's leadership, received Margaret's call with urgency. An emergency meeting was set for the following afternoon. Eleanor arrived not as a passive observer, but as a key player. She wore navy, sharp, clean lines, and moved with the grace of someone who had already mourned what was lost. Margaret entered just behind her, a quiet thunderstorm in pearls and tailored wool, nodding to longtime shareholders like generals nodding to their captains. Daniel was already inside the boardroom, documents stacked neatly in front of him, his usual calm now laced with a quiet fire. Edward walked in late, his face drawn and pale, his usual polish cracking under the weight of exposure. The board members didn't greet him warmly. Most barely looked at him. He took his seat at the head of the table but immediately felt the shift, the power no longer centered around him. Margaret took her place beside Eleanor, and Daniel stood. With clinical precision, Daniel outlined the paper trail, undisclosed personal spending, diverted charitable funds, and evidence of deliberate misreporting to avoid shareholder scrutiny. He presented travel records and surveillance timestamps, enough to show that Edward had used foundation resources to support his affair with Talia Langford, including lavish vacations disguised as business trips. The board members sat in stunned silence as the depth of the misconduct became clear. No one mentioned Talia by name, but she was already gone. Her social media accounts had been wiped clean of any photos with Edward. Rumors suggested she had fled to the south of France, cutting off contact to avoid legal repercussions or public humiliation. She had ridden the wave of Edward's wealth, but as it began to crash, she disappeared without a trace. That evening, Edward returned to the townhouse alone. He found Eleanor in the nursery, quietly folding freshly washed baby clothes. She didn't look up when he entered. The silence between them stretched painfully. "Eleanor," he said, voice hoarse, "I made mistakes. I was selfish. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but please. I'm asking you to forgive me. For the baby's sake. For us." She turned to face him then, her eyes calm, steady, no rage, no tears. Just clarity. "You didn't just skip a baby appointment, Edward," she said, her voice soft but razor sharp. "You skipped fatherhood. You left when it counted most. And I won't let our daughter grow up thinking that's what love looks like." He had no response. Only silence. And in that silence, Eleanor turned away, not in anger, but in something stronger, resolve. In the early hours of a cool spring morning, Eleanor awoke to a sharp, insistent pain that told her the baby was ready to enter the world, sooner than expected. The hours ahead blurred into a whirlwind of urgency and quiet strength. Daniel was the first to arrive, calm and efficient, helping her gather what she needed while reassuring her in that steady voice she had come to trust. Margaret followed quickly, her usual composed exterior softened by concern as she offered Eleanor a reassuring smile. Together, they hurried Eleanor to the hospital, the car cutting through the quiet streets under the silver glow of dawn. When they arrived, the atmosphere shifted. Edward was waiting in the hospital lobby, but Margaret's expression hardened immediately as he approached. "You're not coming in," she said firmly, her voice sharp and unyielding. Edward's protests were muffled beneath her steely gaze. "This is Eleanor's time. You lost your right the moment you chose absence over responsibility." Reluctantly and with clenched jaw, Edward stepped back, swallowed by the sterile walls of the hospital and the cold reality of his exclusion. Eleanor's labor was long and taxing, but her resolve was unwavering. Margaret held her hand through every contraction, whispering words of encouragement. Daniel paced nearby, ready for anything, his presence a silent promise of protection and support. Hours later, the room filled with the first cries of new life. Eleanor's exhausted face lit up as the nurse placed a tiny, wrinkled bundle into her arms, a perfect, healthy baby girl. Tears spilled freely as Eleanor held her daughter close, feeling the rapid heartbeat against her chest, a soothing rhythm after months of uncertainty and pain. She whispered softly, voice trembling with both fierce love and quiet promise, "I'll never let you feel abandoned." In that moment, the weight of betrayal, the absence of a father, and the fractures of family all melted away, replaced by the unshakable bond between mother and child. Lily Rose Whitmore was born into a world already complicated, but with Eleanor's strength holding her, she would know a love that was steadfast, chosen, and unbreakable. A year had passed since the storm that had upended Eleanor's life, and the quiet countryside of Oxfordshire had become her sanctuary. The sprawling green fields and the soft rustle of leaves offered a stark contrast to the polished but suffocating world she'd left behind in London. In a charming, sunlit cottage nestled among wildflowers and ancient oaks, Eleanor and Lily had built a new life, one grounded not in wealth or status, but in love, resilience, and hope. Eleanor had channeled her pain and strength into creating something meaningful, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting abandoned and vulnerable mothers, a cause deeply personal to her. The Lily Rose Foundation, named for her daughter, offered counseling, financial assistance, and community for women who, like Eleanor, had faced betrayal and isolation. The foundation had grown steadily, attracting volunteers and donors who believed in the power of compassion and second chances. It gave Eleanor purpose beyond motherhood, a way to transform her heartbreak into healing for others. Margaret visited regularly, crossing from London in her sleek black car each week. Their relationship had softened into something like mutual respect and genuine care. No longer distant or cold, Margaret was a steadfast presence in Eleanor and Lily's life, often reading stories to the child or helping Eleanor with foundation events. Daniel remained close as well, no longer just a lawyer or advisor, but a trusted friend and confidant. His calm support was a steady anchor, and while their bond was purely platonic, Eleanor cherished his quiet presence, a reminder that loyalty and kindness still existed. Edward's involvement was limited and formal, confined to court-approved visitations that were more about obligation than affection. He met Lily twice a month under supervision, the visits stiff and awkward, lacking the warmth Eleanor had once hoped he'd bring. He was no longer a central figure in their lives, a shadow eclipsed by Eleanor's fierce determination to protect her daughter's innocence and peace. One evening, after tucking Lily into bed, Eleanor sat by the window with her journal in hand. She wrote slowly, each word carrying the weight of everything she had endured and overcome. "It wasn't the betrayal that broke me. It was the silence. But now, my daughter hears nothing but love." As the candle flickered beside her, Eleanor closed the book and smiled softly, knowing that while the past could never be undone, the future was hers to write, filled with hope, strength, and the unbreakable bond of mother and daughter. "My dearest Lily. As I write this letter, you're still so small, your fingers curling around mine, your soft breath steady in sleep. One day, when you're old enough to understand the world's complexities, I want you to read this and know the truth of your beginnings, not to cast shadows on anyone, but to light a path for you to walk with strength and grace. Life is not always loud and dramatic. Sometimes, strength is quiet. It's the steady heartbeat beneath the storm, the calm that carries you through the darkest nights. It's waking each day knowing that no matter what has been taken from you, there is a power inside that can never be stolen. That power is your birthright. Your father gave me wealth, the kind that fills bank accounts and builds empires. But wealth can be fragile, tied to titles and possessions that can shift and vanish with a single choice. What I found with you is something far greater, power rooted in love, resilience, and the courage to stand tall when the world tries to bend you. I want you to understand that love is a choice. It is not something that comes without effort or sometimes pain. But when love is chosen with dignity, when it is nurtured by respect, honesty, and unwavering commitment, it becomes unshakable. That kind of love builds families, creates legacies, and shapes the way we see ourselves and others. You are my greatest gift, Lily. Not because you are perfect, but because you remind me daily of what truly matters. You are the reason I found my voice, the reason I stopped accepting less than I deserved. Through you, I discovered that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. There will be times when the world feels unfair, when people disappoint, and when silence feels like the loudest betrayal. Remember this, you are never alone. You carry within you the strength of generations before you and the fierce love of those who will always stand beside you. Your father gave me wealth. But you, Lily, you gave me power. With all my love. Mom.